Thank you so much, John. Thanks everybody for coming out. I had a nice drive from Cleveland today. The snow wasn't, it was just sort of, picturesque, but it's really great to be here. And John, you're right, it is fun to actually not be an administrator for a night and remember that I am a scholar. I actually came to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame from academia. I was an English professor for many, many years, so it's great to be back here. And in fact, this is a project, it's really the last project I was doing before I left academia in 2008 to join the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. And it was the start of what I thought would be a big project, and then my life kind of took a shift. But with the anniversary of the Beatles coming to America this year, we at the museum were doing a lot of programming around the Beatles, and I kind of went back to this and realized there was still a lot of life here, and it was a great connection with John, who I've really enjoyed getting to know the last couple years and talking music with and seeing him perform and seeing him at work, so this is a treat. So what I want to talk about is Black Britain. The fact that, first of all, Britain has a black population and has had, one since about mid-20th century of some size. But you wouldn't really know that from rock and roll history. So that's what we want to talk about tonight. Now, the writing about Britain's accounting of Black British experience, the great scholar whom we just lost, Seward Hall, in 1978 described a historical forgetfulness, the loss of historical memory, a kind of historical amnesia in Britain about the contributions of Black British people. And in response to that sense of amnesia, that sense that Britain has had a black population for some time, scholars, activists, writers have really excavated a very complex history of Black British communities. And we see some wonderful photographs from here from the 50s and 60s. But the excavation also includes music. There's a record label called Honest John's that's put together these fantastic compilations of the first black communities to come to Britain in large numbers in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s, and the music that they were making. So there's a lot there. And in the 50s and 60s, it's as if black people in Britain were really only visible as outsiders, as a problem, as a kind of invading force. So tonight I want to talk about how that invisibility has played out in the history of rock and roll. So despite this kind of work over the last decades, really no major rock history books, interviews, or accounts of the British invasion, which is a very important moment in the history of rock and roll, even really indicate that Britain had a black population, or that the Beatles specifically emerged from a somewhat multiracial environment. Even the best work about Britain in that period, like Charlie Gillette's Sound of the City, or Hunter Davies' 1968 biography of the Beatles, or the new extraordinary, it's the first volume of what's going to be 3 volumes of biography of the Beatles by Mark Lewison. The first volume's like 1,000 pages, and it only gets you to 1962. They really just don't address the fact that England has black people. And I think the absence of Black Britain implies that the only contact that bands like the Beatles and the Stones had with black people was through American rock and roll and blues records. So a little bit of history. England has had a black population since the 16th century that grew alongside the slave trade. But beginning in 1948, the black population increased rapidly. Because of labor shortages and post-war rebuilding needs, England had lost so many men in the war and through the Blitz. Immigrants from the Caribbean colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados were recruited to come to England to work, and their passage was enabled by the 1948 Nationality Act, which extended British citizenship throughout the colonies. And in 1948, the Empire Windrush, the ship that you see here, brought nearly 500 passengers to England from the Caribbean, most of whom were black, which began the transformation of the country's population. Now, Windrush passengers included Calypsonians like Lord Kitchener and Lord Beginner, And Lord Kitchener sang a new song called "London is the Place for Me" to a reporter after disembarking. And what I want to show you here is a little bit of newsreel about the ship arriving, and you see Lord Kitchener singing this song. So envision this, right? This is somebody who is born in a British colony, right, in Trinidad, and is arriving in Britain with great enthusiasm and actually claiming the city for himself.
Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They serve this country well. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain, citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with good intent. Prodded by public opinion, the Colonial Office gives them a more cordial reception than was at first envisaged. Many are to be found jobs. Our reporter asks them what they want to do.
Now, why have you come to England?
To seek a job.
And what sort of job do you want?
Any type, so long as I get a good pay.
Some will go into industry, others intend to rejoin the services.
Now, you're ex-Air Force, aren't you?
Yes.
Are you going back into the Air Force again?
Yes,
Do you know if you'll be accepted?
I think so.
Some plan to return to Jamaica when conditions improve.
I'd like to ask you, please, are you a single man?
I am a single man. I'm only my mother that is depending on me. And I'm also an ex-serviceman.
You're ex-service, RAF, are you?
RAF. I took a course in Scotland in case making, and I'm desirous of going back there to see if I can further, because I like it very much, and I'm trying to help myself and also help my mom.
Their spokesman sings his thanks to Britain.
Now, may I ask you your name?
Lord Kitchener.
Lord Kitchener. Now, I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes, that's
Well, now, will you
true.
sing for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City. Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country. I've been traveling the countries years ago, but this is the place I wanted to know, darling, London. This is the place for me.
Just happened to be a Calypsonian on the ship, right? Now, in 1951, so 3 years after the Windrush, the non-white population of Great Britain was estimated at about 30,000 people. And to think about how this rapidly changes, by 1961, it was 400,000, and by 1971, 1.4 million. A number that would have even been bigger if it weren't for the limitations put on immigration in 1962 by the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. Now, immigrants to the UK could find jobs, and they were specifically recruited for things like construction and nursing, but they faced widespread discrimination in housing. It was very, very difficult to find housing, and they congregated in very rundown rooming houses in neighborhoods that were still badly scarred by the bombing of World War II. So if you look at kind of newsreel and newspaper coverage of that period, immigrants are primarily visible in England as a problem. And they're not really described as British citizens, even though they were. Because I think to do so risked redefining what Britishness meant. Now, the members of the Beatles and the Stones and other British invasion bands grew up during this time of rising immigration. John Lennon and Ringo Starr, born in 1940, the Windrush arrives in 1948, and they lived in cities, Liverpool and London, with significant immigrant populations. But blacks really remain kind of outside this story of the British obsession with rock and roll. So there's a great book by a guy named Dick Hebdige in cultural studies called Subcultures, and he analyzes the relationship between a bit later British youth subcultures called teddy boys, mods, punks in the 1970s, and British blacks, and he thought about how these white subcultures are using music to kind of deal with this immigrant population. He didn't write about the Beatles or the Stones. In some ways, those cultures were too big for Hebdige. But his argument helps us see that white British youth interest in black American music can be seen as a way of almost responding to this new racial definition in the culture. So I'm interested in these questions coming out of that. To what extent can we read the the embrace of black music in Britain in the 50s as a response to this immigration? Can we see African American music as almost a meeting ground between young blacks and whites at that time? Because both of those groups of young people were interested in American music. Or could we see it as a way that young white Britons were almost avoiding the challenge of British identity by looking outside? And to approach these questions, I want to sort of map the relationship between the Beatles and the black community in Liverpool. Just want to show you where Liverpool is, if you don't know. Now, as the most important port in the British slave trade, Liverpool had a significant black population long before the Windrush landed. The transatlantic slave trade really made Liverpool, and you can see kind of an example of its wealth and its heyday. By 1800, just under half of all Europe's African trade was carried out in ships coming out of Liverpool. By 1845, more than 20,000 ships entered its port, which made it the busiest port in the world. After the end of the slave trade, Liverpool became the chief port of emigration to the US. And many African sailors ended up settling in Liverpool and subsequently married white women, many of them Irish, creating an integrated black community along the docks and the south side of the city. And the African population increased dramatically when, beginning in the 1870s, Liverpool shipping firms hired thousands of West Africans. And historians estimate that in the first half of the 20th century, about a third of the labor force working British ships, about 66,000 men, were from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Arabian Peninsula. So in 1948, the same year that the Windrush ship lands, Liverpool's black population was 8,000, which is approximately 1% of the city's total population, but very different from anywhere really in England at that time, and significant to the city. So obviously when these things happen, social and musical relationships were very important in this immigration and the communities mixing. And African Americans come into the picture as well. African Americans traveled through Liverpool as sailors, and beginning in 1943, were stationed in Burtonwood, which is a US military air base which operated east of Liverpool. There's a couple of English scholars, Jacqueline Brown and Sarah Cohen, who have done a lot of interviewing amongst black Liverpudlians, and they report a lot of stories of black Liverpudlians who get records from African Americans who are there in the city in the military. Brown describes her informants as having an unwavering reverence of black America for its musical contribution to black Liverpool. The exchange also happens in the other direction. Black Liverpudlian ship workers traveled to America and brought back records. Although Liverpool had really dynamic and important record stores. So the scholar Michael Brocken wants to be careful that we don't attribute it all to sailors moving, but it really is key to the story. African Americans, while stationed in Liverpool, patronized black clubs, and black Liverpudlian women attended American GI dances. So of course there's many romantic relationships between African American soldiers and Liverpool women, white and black. Now, these are two neighborhoods in Liverpool. Toxteth was a district in South Liverpool where blacks lived, and it had a really vital music scene that mixed kind of African music, jazz, and American rhythm and blues. And showing off the African roots of many Liverpudlian blacks, many of the nightclubs have African names like Sierra Leone, the Nigerian, and the Igbo. And a lot of interviews about what happened there suggest that blacks and whites mixed in the clubs, and that the clubs attracted music and musicians from all over the region. And I want to point out here too that where I've got the dingle marked here, which is where Ringo Starr, also known as Richard Starkey, his birth name, lived. So Toxteth and the dingle were right next to each other. So how did black Liverpool intersect with Mersey Beat, generally, the music of the white music of Liverpool, and the Beatles specifically? The city of Liverpool was very highly segregated, and Toxteth was quite isolated from the rest of the city. Paul McCartney and George Harrison grew up in Speke. A new housing estate was at several miles out of the city center. John Lennon grew up in Woolton Village, about 5 miles from Toxteth here. Ringo Starr, though, grew up in the Dingle, which literally borders Toxteth. Those neighborhoods are just blocks apart. And yet, there are almost no references in interviews where the Beatles discuss, or more importantly, where they're ever even asked about the racial makeup of Liverpool, which is curious given the impact of African American music on them. It's the music they love and play. But again, this is how kind of invisibility works, right? Why ask them about something that either didn't exist or you've decided in advance doesn't really have anything to do with them? And this is a picture of the Beatles kind of in their youngest days as they first start picking up guitars. They fondly recall hearing rock and roll records, seeing Little Richard and Fats Domino and the Coasters in movies. But plenty of evidence exists that by the time John, Paul, and George were playing together in the late 50s, they had significant interaction with Liverpool's black population. Now, one thing I want to say about, and it's a great early picture of the Beatles in 1960, this is a quote up here from the rock critic Greil Marcus. He says, when the Beatles signed with EMI, the record company EMI, they weren't merely in touch with their roots. In a significant and probably unique sense, they were their roots. They're not only a product of the pre-Beatles era of rock, they were a version of it. The Beatles start playing rock and roll, not as a band, but just as individuals. They start trying to play it as it's really kind of coming out of the gate. 56, 57, they are picking up instruments and they want to play this music. So while they don't record until several years later, I think it's really valuable to see them as kind of a version of the first generation of rock and roll as it emerges in Britain. But at the same time, man, it sounds like there's a good party out there. At the same time, as they're kind of picking up rock and roll, we've got this little blip on the musical horizon in the US and also in Britain around calypso music. Harry Belafonte's album Calypso is released in 1956 in the US and becomes a hit here and Great Britain. If you guys don't know who Harry Belafonte is or this song, you probably know the song known as the Banana Boat song, which you also hear at sporting events where it's, Day-O, Day-O, right? Huge hit, massive hit. It's the first LP to sell over 1 million copies. It spent 31 weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts. And in fact, record companies got so excited about this, they started to believe that calypso was going to eclipse rock and roll. And in fact, Hollywood made some really bad calypso movies, and it might be the worst movie ever made. It's called Bop Girl Goes Calypso, and it's about a girl obsessed with rock and roll who finally sees the light and chooses calypso instead. Well, of course, it doesn't overtake rock and roll, but it's a big deal. And you can imagine calypso is really gaining ground in Great Britain because you have so many people coming in from Trinidad, which is where calypso is from. And in fact, just to give you a sense of how much calypso is in popular culture, there was a nightly news program in England at the time called Tonight. And at the start of every show, this is a news show, they had a calypsonian, a guy named Cy Grant. He was from Trinidad. He had been in the Air Force during World War II, and he would sing the top news stories as a calypsonian. This really happened.
Okay, 5 minutes later. I thought you were all listening to the Archers or something. A to Z tonight at 9 o'clock. It looks as though ours is A to Z tonight too, beginning with the letter F. Football, fallout, flowers, France, fishing and Phi Grant.
Field Marshal Lord Montgomery appeared on American TV. Field Marshal Lord Montgomery appeared on American TV. The things he said turned the faces red. He suggested American blood be shed. The briefest comment to date was the President's round of 108. We bring you the news you ought to know in tonight's topical calypso.
So imagine you're turning on your news at night, and that's what you're seeing is a calypsonian, right? One of these new immigrants singing the news. So it turns out that the first song John Lennon ever writes in 1957, we don't have a version of this, we haven't heard it, but it's been churned up by Mark Lewison in this new first volume of his biography of the Beatles, is called Calypso Rock. I say that not because I'm saying that the Beatles were influenced by calypso necessarily musically, but this was the music in their popular culture, in their everyday. So when John Lennon is first trying to figure out, okay, how do I play my guitar? How do I write songs? This is kind of music that's in the air to him because it's on nightly news. And of course, this is an era, not only in American TV are there only a couple of channels, but in Great Britain, there's one channel. Right? So if you're seeing any TV, the idea that a Calypsonian is on the TV is there for you. But that's not really all there is. At every stage of the Beatles' pre-recording career, black musicians played a role as support, as inspiration, and as just fellow travelers on the scene. Paul McCartney described it once in a 2008 interview. He said, Liverpool was the first Caribbean settlement in the UK, and we were very friendly with a lot of black guys. Lord Woodbine, he mentions, who I'll talk about in a minute, Derry and the Seniors. They were just our mates we hung out with. Now, the Beatles' conduit to Black Britain was Alan Williams, and you see him on the photograph on the left, on the far left, the gentleman with the beard. He was from Liverpool, he was Welsh, and he really fancied himself kind of a bohemian, and he owned several clubs around the city. He sang regularly in pubs and West Indian clubs, Caribbean clubs around Liverpool. And in late 1958, he opened a club called the Jacaranda. And the photograph on the right is taken in the Jacaranda. It's still a bar you can visit in Liverpool. It was a coffee bar. And it was near the Liverpool Art Institute, or the Art College and Institute, which was a hangout for Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and Stu Sutcliffe, who was in the band. And eventually the beginning forms of the Beatles played there. The house band, though, at the bar was the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. And you see a photograph of them there. That's the Royal Caribbean Steel Band at the Jacaranda in 1960. And it was led by a guy named Lord Woodbine. Now, Lord Woodbine, his name was Harold Phillips. Calypsonians would typically describe themselves as Lord somebody, right? And he was from Trinidad, and he had come to England on the Empire Windrush. And you see him there, third from the left, on that photograph on the left. He ran a strip club for Alan Williams called the New Cabaret Artists Club, and also ran his own club in that Toxteth neighborhood I showed you called the New Colony. The Beatles, who were at that time known as the Silver Beatles, played at both clubs in the first half of 1960, which is not sort of a dreary point in their early career. Alan Williams has said in interviews that John Lennon sometimes slept at Woodbine's club, and stories circulate in Liverpool amongst the black club goers there that the Beatles sometimes jumped on stage with the band and tried to play steel drums. Hard, it's funny to imagine that. Now, the Royal Caribbean Steel Band left the Jacaranda, this is very important in the Beatles story, to play at a club in Hamburg, Germany. They contacted Williams and encouraged him to visit and check out the hot music scene in Hamburg. Lord Woodbine accompanied Williams on his first trip to Hamburg to scout out possibilities for the Liverpool bands. And then they traveled with the Beatles on their first trip to Hamburg in August of 1960. And that photo on the left that you see, that's en route. The Beatles are taking their first trip to play in Hamburg, which became a really important site for them. It's where they really cut their teeth as a band. And memories of this time really still resonate in Black Liverpool. Some of the older folks in the community really argue that the Beatles took a lot of their musical ideas and their actual songs from the music they heard in Woodbine's clubs. I don't know if that's true or not. People talk about them picking up particular chords. When Woodbine died in 2000, Spencer Lee, who's a DJ for the BBC and is an author and has written a lot about Liverpool, dismissed this idea that somebody like Lord Woodbine could have any impact on them. I think it's less about, can we trace this one part of this song to this one person, but to really understand that they were in this very creative, increasingly multiracial environment, which at that time was kind of a new experience for white Britons. So what we do know is that as teenagers, the Beatles spent time with these guys and spent a lot of time around Lord Woodbine. Now they go to Hamburg, which again I just want to show you on the slide, really another port city, really important in their history. And you think about them traveling to Hamburg, it's only 15 years after the end of World War II, right? And these countries had been at war. And Hamburg was a tough city. It was Germany's main seaport, really, really devastated by bombing raids in World War II. And by the time the Beatles show up there, Hamburg had a reputation as a city of vice and criminal activity. And where there is vice and criminal activity, there's often awesome music. And that was true in Hamburg. And it became this place for the British bands. But really, the ground was laid by these black British artists. So a native black Liverpudlian who played a role in this Hamburg part of the story was a guy named Derry Wilkie, and you see him on the left there. He was a lead singer of a band called Derry and the Seniors. They were a Liverpool R&B band that also included a guy named Howie Casey on saxophone, who goes on to play with Paul McCartney and lots of other folks in the 1970s. And Derry Wilkie was actually born in Liverpool, so he's not an immigrant. In 1941, he was the son of a West African father and a Welsh Jewish mother. They were the first rock and roll band out of Liverpool to go to Hamburg under the management of Alan Williams. And they were such a hit there that the club owner asked for more bands. And that led to the Beatles coming over. Now, all accounts are that Derry Wilkie was a great, great showman and a performer kind of in the style of Little Richard. In correspondence with me, Spencer Lee, who I mentioned before, described him as a Little Richard extrovert. And when the Beatles got to Hamburg, they knew they'd have to beef up their stage act in order to compete with Derry and the Seniors. I want to play a recording of, they had changed their name to Howie Casey and the Seniors, but this is a recording of them, a song called Double Twist. This was recorded in 1961, and it was an album called Twist at the Top, 1962. This is before the Beatles are releasing records. Just to give you a sense of Derry Wilkie's vocal style and the kind of sound that you would have heard in Hamburg, and you can definitely hear some Little Richard here. These guys were playing for hours in these clubs in Hamburg, and they needed music that kind of exciting for a pretty worked up, probably pretty drunk crowd. In 1972, John Lennon described Derry and the Seniors in an interview. He said they had saxes, they were really a together group. They had a black singer who couldn't really sing, but he was a real showman. So we had to compete with them at first. And we had to start putting on this show to get people into our club. They were kind of at competing clubs. Alan Williams described Derry and the Seniors as kings of Hamburg. Derry did a kind of love-making act with the mic. He whiplashed the electric lead at the audience and worked himself into a musical frenzy, taking his audience along with him. So in order to get through these 6 or 7 hour nightly sets, the Beatles had to kind of in some ways imitate the Seniors' energy, I think. And they also played a lot of long instrumentals, which are good if you're doing a long set at the club, right? That could keep the crowd dancing and really fill out the set. But the two bands were really friendly. And Derry bounced around in a number of bands after that, including a band called Derry and the Pressmen. But he never broke out of Liverpool even after the Beatles hit it big. Another group, another group that interacts with the Beatles in this period is a group called the Chants. And after the Beatles had a proper manager in Brian Epstein and they got a recording contract, they developed a relationship with the Chants, an all-black Liverpool kind of rock and roll doo-wop vocal group who looked to the Beatles for help in trying to get a gig to play at the Cavern Club in Liverpool and in making a record. And the Beatles did help them out. They were fronted by two brothers, Eddie and Chris Anno. They were born in Liverpool, and their parents had come from Ghana. The Chants began as a group called the Shades, and they were influenced by American doo-wop records that they heard from American GIs. They met Paul McCartney at a Little Richard performance, and there's actually a photograph of this. in late 1962, and McCartney invited them to audition at the Cavern Club, where the Beatles backed them up. So actually you're seeing Little Richard there with the Beatles, with two of the members on the Chants on the left, and then on the right is Derry Wilkie from Derry and the Seniors. Again, that kind of scene. Now, Eddie Amu from the Chants claims that the Beatles went, quote, apeshit when we started to sing at the Cavern. I can still see George and John racing up to the stage. The invitation to make our Cavern debut was given as soon as we finished the song for them, and they insisted that we perform that night. Brian Epstein really didn't want the Beatles to be backing up this unknown group because he felt like it would hurt their reputation, but they persuaded him to change his mind. And Brian Epstein managed the Chants briefly in 1963, but they went on to other management and recorded several records in 1963 and 1964, and also played in Hamburg. And what's interesting, again, for thinking about how visible in some ways at the time some of these groups might have been. They played on, they were on television. Britain had a number of great rock and roll shows. This is a clip I'm going to show you from a show called Jukebox Jury, and this is a song called I Could Write a Book, a song of theirs, and you'll hear that. It's kind of a mix of, what we now call doo-wop music from the 50s. At the time, we'd think of it as vocal harmony music with a sort of Beatles arrangement. And they go on to do, they record a number of soul records under other guises later in the 60s and in the 70s. Just a couple other things I want to mention before kind of turning to some of the Beatles recordings of American soul music. This has been a current obsession of mine to figure out who this guy is. This is a guy named Davy Jones, who was American, apparently also of West Indian descent. We think that his family may have come from the Virgin Islands, but he was in Britain and Hamburg at this time, and he got the Beatles to back him up in late 1961. This is with Pete Best still as their drummer, and he backs them up. The Beatles back him up for two shows, one at the Cavern and one in New Brighton in December of 1961. And he's touring around England, and he records a number of records here in the United States in some southeast around Florida labels, goes to Britain, records some minor hits there, and then comes back. Not much happens to him, but again, there's this sense that there's this real attraction for a kind of mixed scene at the time. And I think these photographs have only kind of recently been unearthed. And then George Martin, who became the Beatles' producer, comes into this story. He signs the Beatles in 1962. But in the 1950s, Martin was signing all kinds of artists to Parlophone Records and producing them. And he signs this band called the Southlanders. They were from Jamaica, but they were also influenced by American doo-wop music of the 1950s, and Martin produced 4 singles for them. And again, remarkably, they end up
now you're
on
all
British
singers.
TV.
Are you going to sing now?
Again, this material is circulating through British popular culture. So the Beatles' contact with black Liverpudlians, both new immigrants and natives, is extensive. What's unknown, of course, because nobody asks them, which makes me slightly crazy, is sort of how they responded to some of that, and how their exposure to American rock and roll was enhanced by that contact. Certainly it's clear that their frenetic playing in Hamburg was influenced by Derry Wilkie and the Seniors, and may perhaps have even ignited Paul McCartney's love for Little Richard. He records so many Little Richard songs. But I'm sort of interested in thinking about the difference between the Beatles and the Stones in this regard, and as well as other British bands of the time who were more interested in the blues in older forms of African American music than the African American music kind of their time, of their contemporary time. And if you look at the Beatles' history, they were always drawn to, as players initially, and then when they were recording a lot of cover versions, we'd call them, they were interested in contemporary black music, whether it was Little Richard or Fats Domino, or by the early 1960s, Motown and the girl groups. And this is true of pretty much all the Liverpool groups. Jerry and the Pacemakers, Howie and the Seniors. They weren't like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, who kept looking back in the history of African American music. And the other really significant difference I think about the Beatles and some of the British groups who were interested in the blues is that the Beatles never tried to be black. They never tried to imitate black speech or stage moves in the way that Mick Jagger, to take the most obvious example, always tried to do. In some ways, I would argue that the Rolling Stones treat black people as symbols. The Beatles seem to treat black people as fellow musicians and very modern and very contemporary and kind of cutting edge. And I think about that, if that has some impact, because they were growing up around a much more kind of complicated racial environment and less segregated in a racial environment. There's absolutely no evidence that the Stones had this kind of contact with immigrants in London at the time. And I think, and the reason this is an important question in the history of rock and roll is because of the racial politics of this music, where it comes from, who has license to play it, who makes money off it. And the British groups, in some ways, have always kind of claimed to be colorblind, right? Well, we didn't see racial problems, but in fact, they were living in the middle of them. But it's almost like when they thought about American music, they could kind of get a pass on those kinds of questions. The other key thing about the way the Beatles were responding to the black music of their time is that they were really attracted to the sounds that are or have often been left out of what counts as the most important rock and roll, like girl group music, like pop music, like early soul music. For example, at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there were no girl groups who were so dominant on the charts between about 1958, 59, really up until the British invasion and a little bit past it, for years and years and years into our induction process. A group like the Shirelles, who recorded Will You Love Me Tomorrow, were eligible at the first Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1986 and did not get inducted for another decade plus. It was sort of as if, ironically, the Beatles and the Stones, as guitar-driven male rock and roll, defined everything backwards, right? But when you actually look at the music the Beatles played live and they recorded, they were really always looking to what is the black music of right now that I'm most interested in, and that included things like Motown and girl groups. So I want to play a few examples of cover versions by the Beatles, and to point out the music that they were drawn to, and we can think about where it might have came from, what brought them to it. I'm going to play three samples here in succession. All three of these songs they released on their second album in Britain called With the Beatles. You see it in the bottom there. In the United States, they came out mostly on an album called The Beatles' Second Album in 1964. And they cover Barrett Strong's Money, the Donés' Devil in His Heart, and the Marvelettes' Please Mr. Postman. So what I've got here for you is a sample of the original and the Beatles cover. But you can see this is the music they're actually hearing on the radio and picking up in record stores in Britain.
He's got the devil in his heart. God is earth eternal lies. He's going to tear your heart apart. Oh, his lips, they really thrill me. Oh, I take my chance.
She's got the devil in her heart. For the eyes they tantalize. She's gonna tear your heart apart. Oh, her lips, they really thrill me. I'll take my chances.
Oh yes, wait a minute, Mr. Postman. Wait, hey, 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 Mr. Postman. Mr. Postman, whoa, yeah.
accidentally skipped it. This is actually the earliest video we have of the Beatles. You may have seen it at some point. It gets circulated a lot. But this is a cover of sort of a minor R&B song here in the United States called Some Other Guy by Richie Barrett. It didn't chart in 1962. That the Beatles are playing live. And this is the first film of Ringo Starr as the drummer. Let's see if I can find it. This is at the Cavern Club. So then this is another example of them performing that R&B of the time, that soul music of the time.
At this midday session at the Cavern, we proudly present the Beatles.
Amazing that there was never a fire in the Cavern Club. It's way down. There was only one entrance in it, and it's sweating, and the walls are sweating. There's a woman named Frida Kelly so the Beatles played, and you guys are in John's Beatles class might know this, the Beatles played lunchtime gigs at the Cavern. So if you were working in downtown Liverpool, you could take your lunch and go down and hear them. And apparently the club really stunk. So people talk about, like, you could never lie to your boss about where you were at lunch if you stayed too long, because you always stank like the Cavern, the smoke and everything. But there's a woman named Frida Kelly who was she was just a fan. She started to go see them when she was 17. She apparently saw about 2/3 of all shows the Beatles ever played at the Cavern, and she ended up going to work for their manager, Brian Epstein, and ran their fan club. And I asked her, she visited us at the museum last year, and I asked her about black fans in the Cavern and the Beatles. And she said, yeah, there was always a small group of both young black women and black men who were coming out to see the Beatles at that time. It's not reflected in that particular piece of footage, but there was somewhat of a mixed audience. But when you look in the history of rock and roll, you still see sort of Britain depicted as a kind of an entirely white place. It really persists in the narrative. I mentioned Mark Lewison's book, which I admire a lot and has dug up so much incredible information, but never really, he might mention individual people, but the idea that this had an impact on what Liverpool and Britain was is really there. And I think what happens then is that you can say that the British people's interest in black music and playing of black music is sort of less implicated in issues of appropriation than Americans. I also think it's allowed Americans to kind of lionize white bands playing black music who were supposedly free of racial complications. So young whites kind of got interested in hearing the blues more from British musicians than from black American musicians. But more importantly, I think, it doesn't allow us to sort of see and learn more about what might have been a really interesting, fluid, and interactive, multiracial environment, and to consider that these young white British kids might have been inspired by the presence of new immigrants in their midst. It might have seemed part of maybe some hope that Britain was going to become a very different place after the war. And so ultimately, the invisibility of black people in British history obscures important real racial dynamics in British rock history between Britain, America, colonialism, and black immigration. And I'll just throw one example for something that comes a little bit later. Jimi Hendrix, whose career first breaks in England in 1966, people talk about the fact that he's welcomed in England because London was free of racial prejudice. One of his girlfriends, who was white at the time in England, said, "Here in those days, people couldn't see color. It wasn't a point of contention." And this is a quote from Mitch Mitchell, Jimi Hendrix's drummer, the Jimi Hendrix Experience drummer at the time. He said, "Color never entered into it at all, certainly not in England." And that's what you hear a lot, like racism didn't exist here, we didn't see it. But by the time Jimi Hendrix was there in '66, and really by the time the Beatles were playing, this discrimination that I talked about earlier against immigrants, including major riots in London in 1958 in a neighborhood called Notting Hill, had occurred. There was real tension. And in fact, London newspapers described Hendrix pretty regularly with racial slurs. They called him a wild-eyed revolutionary from the Caribbean, the wild man from Borneo, Mau Mau, which is the name of the revolutionary group in Kenya. It's like they couldn't really make sense of Jimi Hendrix and talked about him as this very sort of exotic, potentially dangerous figure. So race, if we think about it, as it works in kind of British colonialism, was very much in play around somebody like Hendrix. So somebody like Hendrix is received like as a curiosity. It's like we're back in old colonial times and they're bringing back exotic birds from the new lands, and now we have these exotic musicians. And in some ways, Hendrix's popularity in Great Britain might have been attributed to that exoticism, like, ooh, this is somebody in our midst that we haven't really seen before. But what's really, really important is that the Beatles didn't treat black music like something exotic or other or outside themselves. They seemed to just want to grab it and saw some interaction, which, as I think this through, I think really has to have something to do with the way people were living and working and kind of playing together in emerging Liverpool. Now, I want to wrap up by talking about the Beatles coming to America. So by the time they come here, they're huge in England, and they're breaking across Europe throughout 1963, and they have huge success here by playing American music, playing soul music. That's the stuff I played you is the stuff they cut their teeth on. And ironically, and I'm sure to their dismay in many ways, they push a lot of African American music off the charts. If you look at rock and roll between sort of the first generation of America up until about 1958 and 1963, it's really dominated in that period by African American musicians. Soul music is really coming out, and Motown is just killing it by 1963 and 1964. And a lot of those groups can't hold up to the popularity of the Beatles. I'm going to play a very short interview clip from Benny King of the Drifters, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, talking about the impact of the Beatles. And where is my clip? It's hiding in there.
We were cut off at a time we was just getting ready to become stronger than strong ourselves. I mean, the song, all the signs were there that the music that was being created right here at home was going to be tremendously big. And then all of a sudden, these kids came along and stopped all that. And it was a strong pill to swallow. I think the only one that survived out of that thing was someone like James Brown, because he was so far to the left of what they were doing, it didn't affect him.
You got your high sneakers on, slipping new.
So James covered all of what was going on and what blacks felt that they needed musically to survive through the Beatles thing. And then the whites that said, hey, well, but look what we have. These kids are great, and look at their hair. And there's only 4 musicians, and they're brilliant. And they were screaming. The girls was fainting. The Beatles had all of what the whites needed to keep them going.
Keep me uptight.
The thing that we had created with the Drifters and us was in the middle of all that. There was no separatism there. We had collected a people to listen to a music. But when they came along, there was area, because blacks can't grow their hair long and straight, and I forget that. So they came along with long straight hair, and that happened. That changed the whole attitude of the music in a racial way. So there was no competition in what we were doing in comparison to what they had done when they landed here. We couldn't compare to that if we tried for another 200 years. No way. Maybe if we would have had Michael Jackson, maybe.
The same month as the Beatles' conquest of America, Lieber and Stoller released Go Now by Bessie Banks, a return to their first love, R&B. In a sign of the times, the song never reached a white audience until it became the first American hit of one of the new British bands, the Moody Blues. The Beatles' success signified the dawning of a new era. In fact, some would say that they had even saved rock and roll. But from whom?
That line there from the narrator, it's a great documentary on the history of rock and roll that's kind of unavailable. It was on PBS in the 90s called Rock and Roll, and because of rights issues, you can't get your hands on it. But this idea that the Beatles saved rock and roll, but for who? And in many ways, what you start to see in the 60s is an audience that had integrated, in many ways, kind of resegregating around particular songs. And by the time we get to the 70s, rock is something that we might think of as more being played by white bands, but that was kind of an unimaginable thought in the late 50s and early 60s. In fact, so between 1953 and 1963, the number of records in the top 10 pop charts by African-American artists increased by about 50%. In 1963, the year before the Beatles hit, 35% of all records in the top 10 in America were by African-American artists. And then by the end of 1964, that was down to 21% because the Beatles and other British bands and rock bands were really kind of coming on. So, that's the sort of irony of the kind of impact of the Beatles, but it's not very much kind of where they cut their teeth and the way that they kind of treated and interacted with that music. Now later on, the Beatles go to a very, very different kind of sound and in many ways embrace more sort of European traditions of music as they get into things like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, etc. But it's absolutely the music they came out of. So there's a really significant history, I think, the way different people were meeting around African American music in Great Britain at this time that we're really kind of just beginning to know the edges of, and in a funny way, thanks to the digital age and thanks to these photographs that are taken in these little clubs that can now be posted and these video clips that are up there, we can really piece together this story in a way that even 10 years ago was very, very hard to see. So I'm happy to take questions and comments and any of that stuff. Hope I haven't gone too long, John. Thank you so much for your attention.
I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Lauren is such a consummate professional doing this that even with like a dance party happening next to us, she never skipped a beat and delivered this as if it was as if I hadn't been there. So let's take just a couple of minutes for questions, especially because those of you who are the Beatles class are especially in the know about a lot of this. So if you've got any questions or comments or anything about that raise your hand and we'll be happy to do it. Anybody? Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned perhaps the Beatles being a little bit more prone to, that they might have been more comfortable with black music because of a higher inflation, a highly racially integrated upbringing. Do you have any kind of ideas other than just personal like tastes or artistry that would incline them to be so comfortable with the numbers that they're covering and take them so much more seriously than other groups were?
That's a great question as to sort of how we account for their interest in girl group music, which is what we call it. I think part of it might be the songs that the girl groups were doing. I think we always have to remember, right, that John and Paul are, especially, but also George Harrison, are learning to be songwriters. And the songs that the girl groups were singing were coming out of the Brill Building in New York City, which was it was like a songwriting mill, right? It's like you go to work to write songs, right? So imagine that. You go to work, you go in a cubicle, you sit down, you got a piano, let's see if you can write a hit today. That's your job. And one of the impacts of rock and roll in the late 50s and early 60s is that young people now start taking over the songwriting industry. So it's like the kids invade the New York songwriting industry. So somebody like Carole King, who you guys might have heard of, she wrote You've Got a Friend and Will You Love Me Tomorrow. She's 17 when she writes her first huge hit for the Shirelles, Will You Love Me Tomorrow. So there's these songwriting teams in New York, and they're very young. And it's the first place that women break into rock and roll in a significant way, that are just churning out these awesome songs, these great little pieces of pop craft. They go back to a Tin Pan Alley tradition in many ways. And the Beatles learn a lot about kind of hooks and harmony through those songs. But they also love some of the vocal harmonies they take from people like the Everly Brothers, but also from the girl groups, because there's great harmonies on those records. And the arrangements always have great hand claps. And the Beatles' early records are just filled with those hand claps. So I think that the quality of the songwriting and the freshness of that songwriting of a new era was something that really kind of drew them to the girl group music. But it's funny because that music just got dismissed by a sort of macho version of rock history, but yet the Beatles covered, I think, 5 girls group songs just in their first couple of years. Boys, Chains, Devil in Her Heart, Please Mr. Postman, and there's one more I'm sort of missing in there. And some of them are obscure, like Devil in Her Heart by the Donnays. They were from Detroit. That was a regional release, but it ends up getting released in Britain. People hear it. I mean, that's the fascinating way about the way music circulates. You can't always kind of predict it in that way. So long answer, but I think it's the quality of the song.
Yeah, just regarding your thesis a little bit, I lived in London in 1964 through 1966, and I think that there just weren't that many blacks living in London. I mean, you threw up the statistics. It was 1% in Liverpool, probably less in London. So as to why the Beatles and other groups didn't were influenced by it, they just weren't that much a significant part of the population. I mean, as far as the colonies go, I mean, India and Pakistan were much more represented in London than the blacks from the Caribbean or Africa.
Actually, my stats would include those when because we use the kind of term Black Britain to, yeah.
Because I thought the Indian population was quite significant and the Pakistani population was not the black. So that may explain why the Beatles were particularly influenced by Black Britons.
Yeah, I guess I think they were. I guess I'm arguing the opposite. I'm saying they were. In their time in Liverpool, in some of this contact, they were part of their lives in a way that they weren't part of the Stones' lives in London, Right. But yeah, I'm not saying it's massive numbers at all, and I appreciate what you're saying there. But the idea that it's invisible, I think there's too much evidence to suggest that it was sort of an invisible factor in a place like Liverpool.
Yeah, but they weren't really a social factor either, like blacks in America were.
Yeah, very different kind of racial trajectory, but there were riots. There was a huge amount of press coverage about what a problem it was. There were politicians speaking about it. And what's another really interesting thing is that there are increasingly over the course of the 50s and into the early 60s, you begin to see black characters very regularly in British film and British fiction. The literature that's coming out, they're called the angry young man generation. John Osborne's Look Back in Anger and Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. Increasingly, all of those books, and they ended up in quite popular films. And then there's some really, there's some good like soap opera type movies that always involve kind of interracial romance. But increasingly, you're seeing that. So I'm just trying to put it in context of that emerging kind of idea in pop culture. As pop culture, I guess, is a way where you see people maybe beginning to respond to this change. And of course, by 1967, 68, it's really a huge issue. And the British politician Enoch Powell, is kind of running against immigration by that time. Subculture by Dick Hebdige, Hebdig. It's been around a long time now. It came out in 1979, but it's really it's an interesting exploration of kind of youth subculture, especially around punk, and a 50s subculture called the Teddy Boys, working class guys who are interested in rock and roll, particularly using fashions and cool ways. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the question of appropriation that you addressed part of your time? That you're suggesting that there's a different relationship between black and white people, particularly in the Beatles and their relationship with black musicians, and that it's about positive spin on appropriation means. What has taken up on this?
Yeah, on appropriation, I mean, it just seems to me in popular music, maybe very specifically in rock and roll, you've got to address kind of white appropriation of black music financially, visually, in terms of fashion, in terms of who gets recognized as important and all those things. So I think that's kind of always in the room. So it's kind of why I ended with Benny King, because whatever the Beatles' intentions were, their impact on African American artists was problematic. What I think the argument I'd like to really hone is that I want to recognize that the Beatles maybe had a healthier relationship to blackness, if you think of that, right? They didn't talk about black people as having some essence, some pure soul that they could tap into. They didn't turn black artists into symbols or ideas, which is different than many of the other British artists did at that time, and then as we started to see kind of white rock and rollers later. So I think that's worth noting, yes. And I'm trying not to say they were good and the Stones were bad, but it's remarkable for its absence, that idea. Does that help?
No, I agree with you. I'm certainly, I appreciate the argument because it's not one that people conquer. The other question I have, I guess a follow-up question to that is there a way to think about the way that the Beatles sound approximated, just in the examples that you point out, specifically here, as we all know, the sort of history of the two, and how that relationship, appropriation might not be the best term for that, but how that comes from the racial and cultural politics of that, how that comes from it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it maybe goes back to the point too about Little Building music, the song, like when you hear early Stones records playing blues, they're really trying to do some straight up imitation. I mean, I think basically in 1963, the Beatles were just better musicians at that point than the Stones were. They were just ahead of them as musicians. And it seems like the Beatles are drawing on a wider palette at that point, and maybe less interested in kind of imitating vocal inflection. But yeah, that's really the next step in terms of kind of digging through what their differences are. And what they're attracted to also, that they're not trying to play Howlin' Wolf records.
Right, just as you said, I mean, these kind of obscure intertextual references like the Domains and the Stones in there.
Right, and that's why I just love the idea that the Domains record is sitting in Liverpool, right? And they're also, I think this Hamburg part of the story is really important too, right? Because they're playing 6 and 7 hours a night. And Lewison in this new book actually counts the hours that they were on stage in Hamburg over their 3 visits, because they went there for like maybe 5-6 week periods. And it's astonishing. And you just think about how good you're gonna get as a musician when you play that every night. But they had to get people to dance, and they had to play stuff on the pop charts. But it's not like the Donays were on the pop charts in the Hamburg port, right? So I hope that makes sense. Thank you for that.
This has been fantastic. For those of you who got sort of promised we would do it at 8:15, so we're at 8:15 now. So let's give her another warm round of